As many of you will know, the Society sponsors 6 lectures a year that seek to showcase some of the most exciting and innovative research being undertaken in the UK today. Well, our speaker tonight is Jonathan Saha, who is Associate Professor of South Asian History at the University of Durham and is a specialist in the history of British imperialism in Myanmar during the 19th and 20th centuries. Jonathan studied as an undergraduate at Sheffield University before completing a master's and PhD at SOAS in London. He came to his position at the University of Durham by way of lectureships at the Universities of Bristol and Leeds. His first book, Law, Disorder and the Colonial State, Corruption in Burma, circa 1900, was published by Palgrave in 2013. And he's also published on the theme of colonial history to a wide range of audiences, including in journals such as Past and Present, Modern Asian Studies, and the American Historical Review. He has a new book with CUP coming out next January, Colonizing Animals, Interspecies Empire in Myanmar. In addition to his own research, Jonathan is an extremely effective advocate for greater equality in the history profession. He's been a member of the RHS's Race, Ethnicity and Equality Working Group since its inception in 2017. He was one of the authors of the group's 2018 report, and he's co-chaired the group with Dr. Sadia Qureshi ever since 2019. He's also involved in a number of other networks and advocacy groups with an equality focus. In tonight's lecture, Jonathan looks at small animals in order to address large questions about the power and politics of colonial rule. So I invite you to sit back and listen to Jonathan speak on accumulations and cascades on the ecological impact of British imperialism. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a real privilege to have this opportunity to speak to everybody about my research. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you'll all be able to see my presentation clearly. Right. Great. So, the moist tracks left by elephants migrating through the monsoon forests of Myanmar make ideal homes for frogs. Although shallow for a human, when they fill with rain, the divots and miniature dikes formed through the force of these giants' footprints are deep enough to provide protection for small amphibians to breed. If these passing herds happen to deposit substantial piles of dung, then frogs have even more inviting sites in which they can take up residence. These are opportunities for frogs to flourish that would have been dramatically affected by the advent of British imperialism in Myanmar. Elephants, in their thousands, were conscripted into the timber industry. Their ranges were encroached upon by human cultivation. The accidental amphibian-friendly architecture left in their wake would have been less expansive. Frogs would have had less security from predators and have had fewer opportunities to reproduce. They were unseen collateral damage, one of the unrecorded victims of colonial rule. This abrupt disruption to their world was but one small episode in the history of the ecological impact of imperialism that played out on a planetary scale. Since at least the 1970s, historians have been interrogating the relationship between British imperialism and ecologies. This has usually taken one of 4 forms. Early studies sought to assess the impact of imperial policies in precipitating the degradation of colonial environments. Concurrent with these studies, but with a focus on culture, imperial understandings of the natural world have been subject to critical textual analysis, exposing the place of nature within essentializing and othering colonial writings. Drawing on both of these approaches, some landmark studies have examined the interplay of imperial knowledge, practices and policies as colonial states came to learn about the ecologies over which they nominally governed. This research emphasized the emergence of imperial regimes for protecting the environment, alongside acknowledgement of the deleterious effects of the colonial exploitation of natural resources. More recently still, historians have unsettled some of the premises of these earlier studies by exploring ecological factors as having a role in constituting empires. In these studies, imperialism itself has been shaped by plants, animals, and germs in the colonies as much as it had an impact upon colonized ecologies. Overall, the field has become more alert to the ambiguities of the impact of imperialism on ecologies and has given more space for appreciating the impact that ecologies had on imperialism. A problem that runs across these varying approaches is that of the inherent instability of the historical subjects under study, both empires and ecologies. Neither stay still. Tracing the influence of and effects of one on the other is, as a result, a delicate process that often rests on the use of necessary heuristic devices that can obscure as much as they reveal, such as treating the colonial state as a stable singular actor, framing empire as a unified system clearly divided between metropole and periphery, or reifying a division between nature and culture. The more recent framing of empires and ecologies as co-constituting and becoming with one another provides a more conceptually sound basis for examining the relationship, but it also makes causation near impossible to trace. An avenue to mitigate against these problems of unstable subjects and obscure explanatory narratives, I wish to argue today, is to frame empires and ecologies not so much as singular entities, but as constituted by interactive processes. To put it another way, rather than conceptualizing of the relationship between imperialism and ecology as one between two identifiable and discrete things, even if they are conceived of as historically fluid and entangled entities, historians might rethink them as processes unfolding over time with discernible interactive elements and dynamics. As it is, the fields of both imperial history and ecology have ready-made concepts that can be used to facilitate such a shift in framing: accumulation and cascade. Of the two concepts, accumulation will likely be the most familiar to historians. Imperial history, in particular, has long used the concept to understand the economic drivers for European colonial expansion. More than simply accretion or gathering, accumulation is usually deployed to refer to the ongoing and expanding reproduction of something, most often, although not exclusively, capital. Crucially, at least in a Marxian formulation, accumulation is framed as a self-perpetuating drive and an end in itself. However, it is a concept whose star has declined, and in recent scholarship, most imperial historians have not engaged with it as a central concept within their methodological toolkit. Regardless of this decline, in wider social theory, it is a concept that has been freed from some of the economism of earlier works and has been used to account for the expanding reproduction of social hierarchies, cultural artifacts, and power relations more generally. Even when studies have remained focused on capital in its money form, recent scholarship has taken a broader view of the process behind accumulation, acknowledging its gendered, racialized, and environmental foundations and formations. As a result, although it is a dated concept within imperial historiography, one that has largely fallen out of favour, it is overdue some renewed engagement, given its continued theoretical relevance in aligned fields. Cascade, on the other hand, is possibly a less well-known concept to historians. However, it has been in circulation since the 1960s and is a well-established and much discussed concept in ecology. In its original and most common usage, it is more specifically focused on elaborations of what are called trophic cascades. These are, in their most basic formulation, the indirect knock-on effects of predator species down the food chain in an ecosystem. For example, the study of a trophic cascade might entail examining how the size of a tiger population impacts upon the population and behavior of deer, that then has a bearing on the spread and diversity of the plant life that the deer graze upon. The concept has been defined more loosely since its earliest uses, capturing trickle-up and horizontal effects, and it has moved beyond the focus on the role of predators alone. This has been to the frustration of some ecologists, but is perhaps to the benefit of historians who, as a result, have a more portable concept with which to conceptualize ecosystems in the past. What I find compelling about the concept of accumulation and that of cascade, and what I contend makes them useful for better apprehending the nature of empire's ecological impact, is that they both offer models for systems changing over time according to their own dynamics and momentum. In other words, they suggest explanatory narratives that do not grant individual actors causative roles. I'm going to explore this through the history of elephants in Myanmar in particular. An accumulation in colonial Myanmar took several different forms, but there were two that had the greatest impact on the country's elephant population. One was the extractive teak industry, a mode of accumulation that took on an almost textbook form of accumulation by dispossession, as David Harvey has called it. Capital was accumulated by imperial timber firms, forcibly bringing resources, people, and places into capitalist relations with the backing and intervention of the state. The other was the rice industry, where agriculturalists entered into the world market through their own volition, without necessarily entering into capitalist labour relations, i.e. being alienated from their means of production. And crucially, with the prospect for what Mahmoud Mamdani has called accumulation from below, that is, the opportunity to gain ownership of more land and more cattle, and then purchase labour power and or rent their property to make greater returns. At the same time, elephants, as a species, offer us an opportunity to examine the cascade effects that likely resulted from the profound disruptions to their herds. Disruptions that resulted from a confrontation with their capture, for timber extraction, and the loss and fragmentation of their habitat on the rice frontier. Elephants are renowned ecosystem engineers, spreading seeds, forging forest paths, discovering sources of water, and, as we have seen with regards to frogs, creating habitats. Changes in their behaviours, ranges, habits, diets, and population size will have had knock-on effects across the ecosystems of Myanmar. During the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, Myanmar became one of the world's biggest exporters of hardwoods. Teak was particularly desirable for its use in the production of ships, railway sleepers, and luxury furniture. The rapid development of the timber industry was a vital motor in the expansion of capitalist and colonial relations in this often neglected corner of the Raj. Teak traders financed from Britain were vocal in lobbying Westminster and the government of India to colonize the landlocked rump of territory governed by the once powerful Compound dynasty, mobilizing their connections in both the press and in parliament, as well as within Burmese communities. Following the eventual annexation of Upper Myanmar in 1885, they continued to inveigle upon the local government to intercede on their behalf in the borderlands with Siam, where colonial authority had not yet been securely established. On the ground, the growing swathes of territory that these firms were able to gain privileged rights over through favourable government leases deprived substantial numbers of forest-dwelling peoples of their ancestral access to forests and to the resources held therein. Extractive logging operations and the scientific management of forestry, themselves in frequent tension with one another, came into conflict with the shifting subsistence farming of some indigenous Karen communities. This was a conflict in which imperial firms and the colonial state decisively held the upper hand. The imperial expropriation of timber laid the groundwork for anti-colonial grievances among hill populations. Some of those dispossessed in the process entered the labour market as workers for the very timber firms threatening their communities' modes of subsistence, not least as elephant drivers. In short, the timber industry reproduced in expanded form unstable and conflictual social relations in Myanmar. These were social relations not only between humans. Vital to the industry were elephants. They were vital in two senses of the word. Elephants were essential to labor processes of timber extraction and exportation. And elephants were also lively actors whose willful undertakings and bodily needs shaped the industry itself. The instrumental benefits to exploiting elephants for the timber industry emanated from the innate mental capacities and bodily capacities of Asian elephants. While smaller than their African relatives, they are, of course, famously powerful creatures, capable of dexterously maneuvering heavy objects using their supple trunks. They also have prodigious stamina. When free to roam their habitats, they range over great distances across varied terrain. As close-knit matriarchal herds and as solo adolescent and adult males, they can cover areas of more than 3,000 square kilometers. They are also competent swimmers. Like humans, they are long-lived mammals and have frequently been recorded living over 60 years. Their cognitive powers are recurrently compared to those of primates. Every passing year, new scientific studies incrementally add more evidence of their abilities, including the capacity for self-recognition and self-awareness. They manipulate their environments for their own benefit. For instance, when injured, they have been observed adopting behaviors to optimize their recovery. They are known to independently use tools to manage parasites, regulate their temperature, and, with creative adaptations, access hard-to-reach sources of food. But it's perhaps their attuned social skills that has been most critical in shaping their encounters with colonialism. Through visual and olfactory clues, they can distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar humans. And they are also able to understand and respond to human social cues. But quite apart from Homo sapiens, they have rich lives within their own elephant communities. This shapes their psychology, they grieve, and they break down. Bringing elephants into the labor process meant harnessing their capacities while severing individual social ties with their herds and through recursively inflicting bodily pain. It was an unavoidably traumatic experience for the elephants and held considerable risks to the colonized human labor employed to capture, train, and drive them. These dangers notwithstanding, the colonial regime was eager to facilitate the mobilization of elephants. But there were problems that were faced. First, the difficulties the colonial state confronted controlling elephants and arranging for their capture, and then large commercial timber firms' inability to maintain and reproduce their herds. The British regime asserted that wild elephants were the property of the state. This claim, however, was mostly fictive. To start with, the newly established bureaucracy in the southern coastal regions of Myanmar following the 1852 Anglo-Burmese War struggled to hire elephant trappers. Burmese folk, who had previously made their livelihoods through capturing wild elephants, were reluctant to continue in this line of work when tempted instead by the prospect of riches to be made on the rice frontier, at least not for the level of monetary inducement that the state was willing to offer. Moreover, elephants in the colony were not readily amenable to being controlled. Officials were alarmed by herds of hundreds of elephants that were periodically wreaking destruction on freshly cleared agricultural lands, particularly as rice cultivation accelerated in the 1880s. The booming rice industry developed alongside the growth of the teak industry and had direct effects on elephant populations. Like teak extraction, rice cultivation in Myanmar was of transnational importance. The rich alluvial soil provided fertile ground for the Irrawaddy Delta to undergo a dramatic transformation to become the largest rice-producing region in the world, having ripple effects across the global cereal market. The white rice exported from Myanmar fed colonized populations, labouring peoples, and some non-human animals engaged in commodity production across the empire, most notably in neighbouring Bengal. The Delta was crucial to an interdependent network of food security established through and underpinning British imperialism. The changes on the Delta itself were profound, both socially and ecologically. While patterns of settlement of Burmese people moving to cultivate rice predated British colonial rule, from the 1850s, what was still predominantly a mangrove forested backwater at the margins of political power became a febrile hive of activity. Sparsely populated, isolated hamlets hemmed in by thick jungles and thickets of dense grass in the tidal delta became enmeshed in an extensive tapestry of paddy fields, their populations growing fivefold to becoming thriving commercial hubs, connected by a busy riverine transport network to the bustling imperial port cities of Akyab, Molamine, and Yangon. These social and environmental changes were materialized through the hard labor of pioneering cultivators, human, oxen, and buffalo, most of whom migrated from the northern regions of the country. Whilst uncultivated land was abundant and the agricultural frontier remained open until the late 1920s, these migrants were able to claim their own plots and turn it into wet rice paddy fields. The work this entailed was punishing. The thick forest needed to be felled, the undergrowth burnt, and the remaining dense network of roots dug out. It could take several years for the land to be in a suitable condition to be ploughed and planted. Even then, they were in a precarious position. Flooding, wild animals, and malaria were just some of the dangers that cultivators faced. This work was underpinned by heavy borrowing, mostly from local Burmese and overseas Indian sources. And misfortune could lead to them defaulting on their loan and losing their land to their creditor. But these risks were balanced by the prospect of accumulation, building on the success of the initial acquisition of land in order to acquire more. Begin hiring labourers and renting to tenant cultivators, and make greater returns. For many, though, this was not realised. In the main, primary producers did not retain the wealth generated through rice production, and many agriculturists were in a vulnerable position when the market went into crisis in the 1930s. Precarity and poverty accompanied plenty. The ecological transformation was rapid, and from an elephant's perspective at least, profound. Focusing in on one of the fastest growing deltic areas between 1880 and 1920, around the townships of Dongwa and Miao Mia, and the impact is pronounced. Correspondents in 1886 identified 230 elephants living in local forests. They would frequently raid freshly cultivated paddy fields, destroying their crops and jeopardizing the livelihoods of these precarious cultivators. The still extensive tracts of kine, sometimes referred to as elephant grass, rendered them elusive to those Karen and Burmese peasants who appealed to the state to either set rewards for their destruction or facilitate their capture, or both of which were permitted under the provisions of the recently introduced legislation for elephant protection. However, just 30 years later, the local settlement report recorded that there were no longer any elephants left living in the area. Elephants would occasionally visit, swimming across from the dwindling reserve forests in neighbouring districts, but they were now rare, unwelcome visitors rather than perennial and potent dangers. While the occasional use of bounties to encourage the killing of some elephants and the issuing of licenses to local elephant trappers would have had some effect in reducing their numbers, it was likely that it was the rapid deforestation of the area to make way for paddy that would have displaced the local elephant populations. The British regime, never entirely successful in realising its claim to Myanmar's elephants, left the capture to colonise peoples through a licensing scheme. These arrangements enabled the large timber firms, such as the Bombay Burma Trading Corporation, to establish considerable herds of captive elephants during the opening decades of the 20th century. By 1914, the corporation had already amassed a herd of 1,753 elephants. Between 1918 and 1941, they purchased a further 543 from elephant capturing firms, allowing for elephants transferred from Siam and animals born from within their herds, as well as mortality. They operated with between 2,000 and 3,000 working elephants in the 1920s and 1930s. Their smaller rival, Steele Brothers and Company, by way of comparison, had a herd of 1,507 elephants in 1934 and a further 365 calves. Estimates for the overall number of timber elephants employed by the 1940s vary, but a figure of around 7,000 or 10,000 including calves would seem plausible. The sexual reproduction of the elephant workforce from within herds, however, was not successful enough to maintain them or make up for the deaths, in part because infant mortality among calves was high, and in part because firms were unwilling to cover the costs of unproductive female elephants now employed in reproductive labour. Although there were some modest schemes for training captive-born elephants that were trialled. Recent studies also show greater reproductive aging among captive elephants working in timber extraction in Myanmar, which may retrospectively explain some of the difficulties the firms encountered. As a result, the majority of the nearly 10,000 working elephants of colonial Myanmar would have been captured from the wild. This very likely tipped the demographic balance of wild to working elephants firmly in favour of the latter. Elephants in Myanmar were caught between two modes of accumulation between 1880 and the 1920s. The timber industry demanded their labour and was predicated upon the social reproduction of their captive state, a situation that could be only maintained at the expense of wild populations. Meanwhile, the expansion of the rice industry was not enabled through improvements in agricultural techniques or technological advances, but through cultivating more and more land. The resulting deforestation meant significant habitat loss and fragmentation for elephant populations. These processes were compounded by hunting, both sanctioned and illegal, in spite of protective legislation. Both the timber trade and rice cultivation in colonial Myanmar have already been framed by historians as tales of differential enrichment and impoverishment. As we shall see, the ecological effects that cascaded from elephants' altered circumstances would suggest that a range of non-human creatures also numbered among those whose lives were impoverished. Identifying fraught and fractious modes of accumulation allows us to better understand the contingent structural constraints within which actors were living, what we might call an analytic of conjuncture. If accommodation, as I hope to have shown, enables us to glean a fuller picture of this particular historical conjuncture, then the concept of cascade allows us to conjecture on the resulting ecological impacts. Pivoting from a conjectural mode of analysis to one of conjuncture based on recent scientific literature is a move that requires care. This is not least because of the dangers of reifying the results of ecological studies conducted in recent years and projecting their findings backwards onto a time when ecosystems were different. Such a move would miss the foundational point that, like all scientific endeavours, ecology was and is entangled in particular social relations and embedded in particular constellations of power. In colonial and post-colonial contexts, this has meant that institutionalized knowledge-making practices and scientific validation of ecological research has often been predicated upon the simultaneous appropriation and marginalization of indigenous understandings of ecosystems, as well as the subordination and exclusion of colonized people within the academic discipline. Natural history, the older parent discipline of ecology, has now been shown to have played a constitutive role in a generation of gendered and racialized discourses that justified imperial hierarchies and bolstered colonial conquest. Ecology, a term whose emergence in the mid-19th century is largely coterminous with high imperialism, informed imperial conservation policies while granting privileged access to protected wildlife to white colonials and local notables, criminalizing indigenous uses of the natural world. All these are powerful reasons for historians to be wary in their engagement with ecology. Wary, I would emphasize, but they should not be aloof from them. The growth in environmental history, although not yet a decisive turn, as Julia Adeney-Thomas has rightly warned, has resulted in an imperative to go far beyond merely tracing and deconstructing changing ideas about the environment in the past, towards instead acknowledging and taking account of environmental factors in history. As practitioners in an aligned subfield, animal historians have developed innovative approaches to uncovering the traces of non-human creatures that went largely unrecorded, but were either implicitly present in the texts or materially necessary for historical processes to have unfolded. To supplement the evidence that can be found among the extant anthropocentric colonial era archival materials that have survived the perpetual instability of imperialism and the struggles of decolonization, it is imperative for historians to creatively engage with relevant scientific disciplines. To abstain from doing so does not allow the historian to avoid being tainted by the power relations at play in the production of scientific knowledge. Instead, such an abstention allows the silences that imperialism helped to produce continue to structure the histories that we write. There is now a growing body of ecological literature that focuses on the Asian elephant. Engaging with this knowledge as a historian requires foregrounding the tentative nature of this research. This is knowledge that is liable to change, as the ecologists conducting these studies frequently and openly acknowledge themselves. The truth claims in this scholarship are hesitant and tentative rather than absolute. They present as observational in nature and are thus reflexively engaged with the spatial limits of their veracity and the necessary conditions for extrapolation. Moreover, though, these are studies conducted after the history tracked in these pages. But that this research has been produced at a new historical conjuncture does not invalidate its utility to the historian. To the contrary, it might be read as establishing a baseline for apprehending the historical role played by elephants at an earlier time when their numbers were far greater, their herds larger, and their ranges considerably less encroached upon. A time of richer biodiversity, when the cultural mass extinction of creatures had not accelerated to the extent that it has in the last half a century. Ecosystems are dynamic and historically contingent, but the functional role played by particular species within them are often resilient, a resilience that allows for the potential of environmental recovery through the rewilding of megafauna. By identifying the roles played today by Asian elephants in tropical forests like those of Myanmar, we can make reasoned conjectures on the cascade effects precipitated by British imperialism. Let us start with their diets. Elephants are huge creatures, and their digestive systems are not especially efficient. In the wild, they absorb up to only half of the nutrients from the food that they consume. When mature, they eat around 100 kilograms a day. When free to range and forage beyond the coercive control of human captors, their staple foods consist of a varied diet of grasses, tree bark, small twigs, and fruits. To accompany this vegetation, they drink from streams and other bodies of fresh water. In the hot season, they use their trunk to tap on the ground and through the vibrations, locate the water table, and then digging to expose the subsoil water, sate their thirst. Salt licks also supplement this diet, providing essential minerals that are otherwise insufficient in the greenery that they devour in great quantities. It is thought that they locate these through their extraordinary sense of smell. These dietary habits have several downstream effects within their ecosystem, some of which stem from the mineral-rich nature of their dung, of which more shortly. Others emanate from the manner of their eating. Their grazing prunes and thins the forest and the grass, allowing more sunlight to reach the surface of the ground. This then facilitates the healthy growth of this plant life, but in turn feeds other herbivorous mammals. The selective nature of their dietary choices also benefits other species. Elephants debark trees, making it easier for several varieties of deer to eat. They also strip twigs of leaves, discarding the unwanted foliage on the ground for sambar, barking deer, and the like to tuck into. Their maintenance of grasses and bush also has an indirect effect on supporting homeostasis in predator-prey relationships. In India and sub-Saharan Africa, this has been shown to be a boon to big cat populations, as well as to the quarry that they hunt. Their discovery of subsoil water and salt licks are also to the benefit of many of the creatures that they live alongside. Gaur, sambar, spotted deer share the salt licks exposed by elephants. Jackals, civets, and wild boars drink from the pools of water created by elephants during the dry season, and peafowls and other jungle birds wash themselves in them. In these various ways, and through their dietary habits alone, elephants perform essential tasks in rendering forest environments more habitable for a range of smaller animals. Their dung is worth considering in its own right. As a result of their low absorption of nutrients, it is especially rich, and the piles of feces left by their herds become micro-habitats for a range of creatures. In a pleasing contrast of what humans would consider sublime and profane, elephant's poo is particularly alluring to butterflies. Some of the minerals found within elephant dung are thought to be essential to the reproductive health of certain male butterfly species, the male of certain species of butterfly. Whilst the excrement remains wet, it attracts hosts of insects, including termites, centipedes, and importantly, beetles. Unsurprisingly, the insectine clusters that congregate on dung draw the attention of birds and reptiles. Peafowl and skinks are known to lurk around elephant poo to feed on the feasting insect populations. But it is not only animal life that thrives around dung piles. They provide excellent conditions for fungi. The mushrooms that flourish as a result form part of the diets of some particularly charismatic fauna native to Myanmar, including sloth bears and star tortoise. However, the most far-reaching downstream effect of elephant dung is probably its role in seed distribution. Indeed, the passing of seeds through the elephant's digestive tract and back into the ecosystem does more than just spread seeds across wider terrains. The digestive enzymes that the seeds encounter in their intestinal odyssey encourage germination, significantly increasing the likelihood of the seeds flourishing into mature plants. A group of creatures that are intimately tied to this process of seed dispersal are dung beetles. Dung beetles depend upon mammalian dung to reproduce. Different species do so in different ways. For instance, tunneling dung beetles, as the appellation would suggest, dig narrow vertical chambers in animal feces within which they lay their larvae. That then hatches, feeds off the habitat and grows and thrives. This tunneling itself has a positive effect, moving nutrient-rich organic material to the upper layers of soil. Aside from improving the richness of the earth, their tunneling also helps to distribute seeds. Seeds that remain in the elephant dung, from the beetle's perspective, are just in the way. They are taking up real estate that could be occupied by their larvae. and so the beetles remove them from the dung and bury them to free up more space for their own kind to thrive. In doing so, they inadvertently protect the seeds from predators and pathogens. They reduce seed clumping and direct the dispersal of seeds to more favourable environments. Their role as secondary seed distributors is worthy of note because of their dependence on mammal communities and because of their population's vulnerability to the threats caused by habitat modification. Although findings are variegated by local ecological factors, overall, studies suggest that high-intensity logging appears to significantly reduce the amount of dung removed by dung beetles and the effectiveness of their distribution of seeds. They are also severely impacted by falls in mammal species and have been identified as being depleted through the cascade effects from game hunting. These observations enable us to think through the cascading effects of accumulation in colonial Myanmar. Not only were there fewer wild elephants roaming across more restricted terrain in smaller herds, but the nature of captivity would have had an impact on the creatures who otherwise benefited from elephants' dietary habits. In Myanmar, when working in camps in forests leased to imperial timber firms, elephants had a degree of freedom. At night, they were permitted to roam around the surrounding forest and forage for food. Although, in this, they were frustrated by the fetters and chains attached to their legs to stop them escaping entirely. Bells attached round their necks alerted their drivers to their locations when they needed to be recovered for work in the morning. As a result, the variety of their diets would have been more restricted than when free. This was recognized by the elephant management literature of the colonial era. What was referred to as the artificial nature of their working lives required artificial interventions into their diet. Burmese elephant drivers were required to procure fodder for their charges, and this was predominantly grass, a variety identified through an engagement with indigenous knowledge as kine. Twigs and bark were deemed to be optional extras to give a bit of variance. But more artificial still were the sugary and salty foods provided to them, such as elephantine chapatis and jaggery sweets that were produced to meet the perceived needs of labouring elephants, who were forced to work during the hours when, during their days of freedom, they would have rested and slept. Their changed metabolism, expenditure of energy, and resulting stress from the hard labour of shifting teak required a more calorific diet, particularly during the hot season when elephants were less able to graze while they worked. Their limited mobility and changed diets would have had cascade effects. Firstly, the dung. Its contents and quality would have been altered with the change in menu. And while it is difficult to know how this would have affected those insects who fed upon it, let alone the creatures further along the chain that predated on them, it seems likely that the restricted range of vegetation and the addition of human-prepared supplementary meals would have reduced the variety of nutrients that passed through the elephants' bodies. The fetters and chains would have meant that their dung was also spread over a smaller range, and whatever defecations they produced during the day would have been located in the areas affected by the near constant disruption of logging. This would have limited the dispersal of seeds, particularly given the grass-based focus of their fodder, and disturbed the insect assemblages otherwise attracted to dung piles, as well as the birds and reptiles that used them as hunting grounds. The presence of humans in the vicinity of the dung would likely have discouraged visitations of cautious animals such as sloth bears, who may have come in search of mushrooms. As already noted above, logging reduces the activities of dung beetles, but would have otherwise removed dung to more favourable sites and facilitated greater seed distributions, and as well as more successful germination. As a result, the spread of vegetation that sustained deer and other ungulates would likely have been more limited through the mass conscription of elephants into the timber industry. The provisions of fodder provided to the elephant workforce the tendency to establish elephant camps near bodies of fresh water for ease of hydration and ablutions, and the hobbling of elephants' mobility would have had knock-on effects. The vital work of elephants in finding and exposing subsoil water and salt licks would have not been done on the same scale, having a direct impact on the health of deer, wild boar, and other small mammals. In considerable swathes of Myanmar, forests would have been left untended by elephants grazing, pruning and thinning of forest and grasses, a gardening role that helped stabilize deer and tiger populations, both of which were also under threat from increased predation from humans. Finally, returning to the frogs with whom I opened this talk, the microhabitats left in the wake of elephants' migrations would have been less extensive. There would have been fewer protected spaces for amphibians, as well as some small mammals to breed hidden from predators. The fate of Burmese elephants during the colonial period was not as apocalyptic as it was for other species in Myanmar. Rhinoceros and crocodiles, for instance, saw their populations decimated to almost unsustainable levels. Elephants were still endangered, but have survived in viable numbers. Nevertheless, the history of elephants contains multitudes. Creatures such as dung beetles and frogs, who rarely make it into archival collections in their own right, were intertwined and implicated in the lives of Myanmar's forest-dwelling giants. The transformations in elephant demographics and behavior wrought by their mobilization for teat production, the destruction of much of their habitats, and widespread hunting cascaded. We might not be able to reconstruct precisely what happened to those creatures who benefited from, even depended upon, the ecosystem engineering performed by elephants, but we can conjecture that life got harder and the margins for survival narrowed. Animal history has opened up new interdisciplinary dialogues between environmental and biological sciences and the humanities. These dialogues have often taken place in one of two conversations. One has been about the advent of the Anthropocene, a term deployed by a substantial number of scientists, social scientists, and humanities scholars to connote a new geological epoch in which humans have become the single largest factor shaping the whole planet's ecology and climate. The second conversation has concerned the pitfalls and benefits of the use of current scientific knowledge to aid our understanding of non-human creatures' actions, motivations, and experiences in the past. Both of these conversations have been, in equal parts, inspiring and unsettling for historians, facilitating innovative approaches to researching and writing animal history, and also precipitating a broader conceptual and methodological crisis within the humanities. These conversations are urgent and valuable, but there are others to be had alongside them. Another subject that animal history's interdisciplinary dialogue might broach, this paper suggests, is a discussion of the concepts that are used for explaining causation and change over time in different disciplines. As I hope to have demonstrated, there are two particular concepts, one drawn from the humanities and the other the social sciences, the humanities and the social sciences, and the other from ecology, that are worth examining to open this new conversation. Accumulation and cascade. The value of both concepts lies in the ability to offer causative explanations of change over time, but do not rely upon there being knowing human agents consciously driving historical shifts. As such, bringing these concepts together can move conversations from the more abstract questions assessing the historiographic import of historians' engagement with environmental and biological sciences towards identifying interdisciplinary tools for explicating the dynamics between or within specific environmental histories. I hope that this lecture has gone some way to demonstrating the utility of both concepts in the case of elephants in Myanmar during the period of British colonial rule. These giant beasts became pivotal for the colony's timber industry, one of the most important sites of commercial forestry in the empire. They simultaneously had their habitats decimated and fragmented by the unprecedented expansion of rice cultivation. Consequently, as frequently identified keystone species and as well-acknowledged ecosystem engineers, the profound changes in the lives of Myanmar's Asian elephants would have had significant knock-on effects upon a range of other flora and fauna. Theirs is a history that is more fully appreciated when it is conceptualized as having been caught up in accumulatory dynamics and cascade effects. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. That was a really fascinating, very wide-ranging and truly interdisciplinary way of thinking about the ecological history of Myanmar. We're going to take a 5-minute break. The question and answer icon down there at the bottom of your screen is open. We'd love you to take a little while to post your questions in there. And when we come back at past, I'll start feeding those to Jonathan. See you all in a few moments. Brilliant. Welcome back, everybody. Jonathan, we've had some questions coming in. I'd like to just get started by putting some of these to you. So I've got a question, first of all, from Shaman Minus. How did hunting elephants for trophies affect the population in colonial Burma?
So it would seem quite extensively. It's hard to put together entirely because so much of the hunting wasn't legal. But one of the ways you can get the sense of how widespread it was is looking at all the legislation which was brought in to try and stop it. And every time they bring in legislation to try and stop it, the preamble to that legislation and the soliciting advice on whether they should bring it from other officials always brings out the fact that it's just not being policed. All the legislation remains effectively a dead letter. And even in the late 1930s, they try and do a survey of just how many crimes against wildlife protection laws had actually been tried. In large swathes of the country, nothing. So it seems that it had quite a dramatic effect, and some of the anecdotal evidence from looking at hunters' memoirs, diaries, and some informal correspondence suggests it was pretty extensive.
Thank you very much indeed. So just spinning on to another question here. Christopher Marsh has asked, a fascinating paper and heartbreaking stuff too. Was anyone aware of the cascade effects or beginning to think about them? And if not, when did this awareness begin to develop?
So in a lot of a lot of sort of natural history and ecology in the early 20th century, late 19th century, in Myanmar at least, is about identifying and finding new species, and it's less about the interaction between them. But you do get some of that insight there. Not so much sort of trying to understand the problems of what's happening to populations, but for things like how certain crops encourage particular types of pests. So you see that type of thinking apparent there. But more widely, there's certainly an awareness of how cascade effects can work from the late 18th century. I think they won't necessarily call it like in those terms, but there is some awareness of those dynamics.
Thank you, Jonathan. So another question here from Prasanna. I'm afraid I don't have a surname. Thanks you very much for a wonderful session. He's a PhD student in history from India. 2 questions. Apart from the hard labour provided by the elephants, they're also considered as a symbol of royalty and sacred by the people of Myanmar. On the one hand, they're forced to do hard labour. On the other, they're considered sacred. And how are these contradictions reflected in history? And in addition, in 2015, Myanmar's forestry department captured a white elephant. Was there any information about white elephants during the imperialistic period? Yeah,
so I mean, there is that contradiction there, which might not be as unusual as we think. Human societies seem to be very capable of holding animals in great regard, whilst also subjecting them to some pretty terrible experiences. In Myanmar, that association hasn't always necessarily been a contradiction for, say, the Kongbao dynasty, because the power of the elephant was part of what was associated with monastic power, with not monastic power, with monarchistic power. And so being able to control and manage and ride an elephant, and a powerful elephant at that, reinforced that sense of reverence that was associated with it. And yeah, in the colonial period, there are lots of interactions with white elephants. There's a famous white elephant in 1884 that travels to London and becomes a subject of a marketing campaign for Peers soap. There's, when the British take over Mandalay, they end up taking over a white elephant that they don't really know what to do with it. They think about selling it, but they don't want to pretend to the throne to get it and use it for their authority. They think about giving it to the king of Siam, but they think that might be insulting. So they don't really know what to do with it. It ends up being taken down to Yangon and becomes the basis around which the zoo is built. Lots of white elephants.
Lovely. And I'm sure you're very right that human beings have no trouble holding two very different views in their minds at the same time. Absolutely. Peter Smith has asked, did the Japanese occupation have any significant effect on the elephant population?
Oh yeah, devastating. They sought to mobilize elephants in the same way that the British did, partly for the total war effort. But the British wanted to deny them those resources. So lots of elephants were released. Many elephants were also used in the retreat over into India. And the figures that are given, that in, as I said, like between 7,000 and 10,000 prior to the war in about 42, by 1947, there were about 2,500 working elephants left. Now, many of those would have died. Many were also stolen and taken over to Thailand, and timber firms tried unsuccessfully to reclaim them. Some may have, disappeared into the wild, but given that they would have spent most of their lives in that form of semi-captivity, their survival may not have been particularly great. So yeah, a devastating impact.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Charlemagne Minus, if the timber industry declared all the elephants as their property, did they then lease them out for festivities like novitiation ceremonies, powwows, etc.? Were ordinary citizens allowed to own an elephant for other purposes besides timber extraction?
Yeah, people did. And, in many ways, timber extraction isn't necessarily the most lasting legacy of the use of elephants. And so in the borders, they're used for transport, for jungle logistics all the time, and are still central to organizations like the Kachin ethnic armies and things like that. They're important in those uses. And in the colonial period, they were still used for ceremonial purposes in some parts of Myanmar. And occasionally you do get these situations where timber firms would lease it to a sort of local Shan Sabwa or Shan sort of chief, who would be able to display the elephant and use it in a parade or something along those lines. And that was a way of the timber firms to try and keep their relationships with these local sovereigns. And so you do see some of that happening. And yeah, despite the state saying the elephants are only ours, people did capture them all the time, and the state effectively allowed that to happen.
Brilliant, thank you. Our next question is from Sorob, and I haven't got a surname, but they write, thanks again for the wonderful paper. Once you argued beautifully that changes in the circumstances of elephants had a cascading effect on other forms of life, one could argue that this is a conclusion that one is likely to reach no matter which species one looks at. For instance, the colonial campaign to exterminate vermin might have had a similar effect. However, I wonder if this conclusion gives us a complex picture of things. Once we agree on the negative effects, what else can we start to look at, and how? There's lots in that question that would be really interesting to hear you unpack, precisely about if there's anything special about elephants, but also if once we've kind of gone off the pessimistic story, what else is there left to say? It's really fascinating.
So it's a great question. And I guess what I was thinking about when I wrote this was about those creatures which aren't archived. And so the elephant is a very, very well documented creature in terms of its history. And it's because it's well documented that you can then draw out the implied cascade effects to what happens to them. Now, there are other species you can do that for. I think vermin species are a good example. And so whether it's the mass destruction of rats or the killing of crocodiles or tigers, because of the damage and the threat that they pose, we might be able to draw out cascade effects from those. Now, not all of them will be like the elephants. Some of them may lead to an abundance of certain types of creatures, which may also be negative in how that then affects plant life that is fed on there. So they're complex things, are cascade effects. But I mean, what this might tell us, which might be more positive, I think, is that case for rewilding and thinking about how history might support particular types of interventions into current creatures at the moment. And I think there's interesting conversations which we can have from there. But it's a great question, and one that I think I need to think about a bit more as well.
Lovely, thank you ever so much. So a question from Becky Taylor here, my colleague at UEA. Thanks, Jonathan. I don't want to get diverted from your methodological plea for historians to think through how we might engage fully with ecological history, which I think is really important, nor do I want to slip into easy anthropomorphization. But I was struck by your account of the impact of work on the natural living patterns and bodies of the elephants. Can you say something about the possibilities for emotional history and animal histories through this kind of work?
Oh, there's a huge amount that could be said there. And there's a lot of work been done on some of that as well. And the types of relationships that elephants rebuild, because I focused here more on the violent trauma of it, because that is unavoidable in what's going on. But in order to make them workers, functionally workers, they need to rebuild some of the psychology of the elephant and rebuild relationships, meaningful relationships that the elephant would then have with elephant drivers and with the people around them, with the other elephants that they brought into contact with. And so there's a very strong emotional element to that and that bond. Timber firms did like to try and keep elephants with a particular driver, although their romantic portrayals of that were somewhat odds with the reality of it. And I think this is one of the tensions. The elephant is not the property of the elephant driver, the Karen elephant driver or the Burmese elephant driver who's there. The elephant is the property of the timber firm. And so ultimately that means in any breakdown between the employers and the employees, where you get elephant strikes, there's a real tension of looking after and maintaining that elephant and also wanting to step away from your work environment. It really exposes the tension between the emotional aspect of the work that these elephant drivers do and the exploitative relationships that they're actually embedded within, let alone the sort of issues of the elephants. And the elephants have a lot of the elephants have emotional responses and violent responses to all sorts of ways that they've been treated. And at least in one instance in the Steele Brothers firm, there was a particularly violent female elephant who killed 5 of her elephant drivers before she was deemed to be unmanageable. And so that emotional element of that relationship is really a constant part of that history.
Right, so fascinating. Thank you, Jonathan. Rachel Beck has asked, she says, and I agree, that was a wonderful talk, Dr. Saha. Here is my question. In many former colonies, including Myanmar and Ireland, where I'm from, native populations continue the harmful land management practices such as unsustainable logging and intensive agriculture first introduced by colonial authorities. Pre-colonial land management traditions are dismissed as uneconomic. How does the historian ecologist account for this phenomenon of native colonialism? A fascinating question there.
So I think part of it comes from accumulation, because patterns of accumulation that are launched and set off in the colonial period do not end when the British leave, when they leave Myanmar or when they leave any colony. Now, the structures underpinning that accumulation do get upset. It struggles to recover in quite the same way. They can't necessarily expand in the form that they used to. The timber industry in Myanmar, for instance, was nationalized. So the elephants from the 1950s become the property of the state, and many of them remain so through to today. But the extractive nature of timber exploitation has continued. And I think a really pertinent example in this moment is the Myanmar military, whose recent coup has led them to try and lean on their extractive industries more than anything else, because they require foreign capital so much. They need foreign currency. And as a result, illegal logging has just gone absolutely through the roof, most of which, a large proportion of which, is going out to be turned into luxury ships through Italy. And so none of the timber coming out of Myanmar is legal. And the Myanmar military is a colonial authority, the way it operates in the border areas. And so these patterns of accumulation last beyond colonialism. But you're right, there are alternatives to this which exist within those societies too. And in Myanmar recently, there's been a whole host of sort of ecological and indigenous community activism that is trying to overturn some of those long-standing practices. And we can't reduce those to being just sort of like long-standing indigenous sort of noble savage motif. There is a very modern form of critique of the military in Myanmar that this comes from. So it's an absolutely great question, but I do think accumulation helps us navigate that history.
It does, thank you. Jared Fitzgerald says, very interesting presentation. Can you tell us more about the companies which gathered and exploited the elephant herds during this time period? Did they produce literature on elephant care, rely on scientists for information, or on native populations for caring for the herds in captivity? And was there a simultaneous military use of elephants for imperial labor during this period?
So there was a simultaneous use of military elephants, but this does decline in the 19th century, but it never disappears, as I've mentioned, really, with the Japanese occupation and in the borders of Myanmar, where today elephants still remain essential. The timber firms do produce a huge amount of internal literature, and that they share with one another, but also share with zoos around the world, and with pharmaceutical companies, with veterinarians in South Africa, a real network of information that they produce, which is hosted still and survives in their archives. They also produce publications and fund government research into this, co-fund government research into stuff. One of the more interesting elements here, though, is there's an acknowledgement that there's a whole swathe of elephant management that they can never access. And that's what the elephant drivers and the Burmese elephant drivers know. And there is an attempt by a leading Burmese elephant driver that uses a nationalist publisher to put out some of their knowledge, or trying to transfer and sort of put that knowledge into a printed form as well, that is backed by one of the timber firms. So you do see an attempt to try and capture that sort of low-level experiential and passed down knowledge about elephant care. But in the main, it tries to take a much more sort of biomedical framing.
Yeah, thank you. A question from Krishna. Did colonialism have a role in the practice of parading and keeping captive elephants in the temples of southern India? Was there a similar practice within religious institutions of Burma?
So, I mean, in the courtly culture, there was certainly a keeping of elephants, and in some of the Shan states, for instance, the political and hereditary rulers there would use them for, I guess, sort of rites of passage moments, and some sort of wealthy people would use those as well, so for weddings and things like that, but not necessarily for explicitly sort of any elephants being sort of tied to temples. There may be some tradition of that there, but it's not something which I've actually come across. And the British, of course, did. You know, with the Durbars, Burmese elephants in particular were essential for all of that parading, and had to be were maintained often for those purposes, used as transport and practical basis, and then used for Durbars and parades. So yeah, it did happen, but not in precisely the same way as you see in southern India, at least so far as my knowledge goes. I could be way off there.
Yeah, no, that sounds really interesting. Erica Fudge, fantastic paper. Do you use different methodology or underpinning ideas when looking at other species in Myanmar? That is, do other animals need other ways of reading?
Yes, I guess I do. But in a way, I've used a whole host of different lenses for elephants. So in the past, I've written about them using a sort of history of science approach, where I've been looking at the construction of them as an object of knowledge, as participants in the production of themselves as an object of knowledge. I've also looked at them in a sort of new materialist way of just how the arrangements of colonialism actually produce new elephant subjectivities in ways that didn't previously exist. But I do think that different species require different types of approaches and different types of histories. But I'm trying to puzzle out, and I'm not entirely convinced that I know and I don't have an answer to this, whether it's more to do with the capacities of those creatures or more to do with the nature of their archival presences. And I think about an amazing article by Rohan Deb Roy about white ants. And you can write a history of the impact of white ants that you couldn't do for a more charismatic species like a tapir, because of their impact. They eat all this paper, they eat these boats, they do all that stuff. But the nature of how you're talking about them isn't as individuals, but as colonies. So I guess I don't have a good answer to it. Intuitively, yes, I think different methodologies are required. I don't think I have a sort of clear steer or sort of programmatic sense of what methodologies for which creatures.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Alma Igra asks, this was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Yet another question about accumulation. Do you see a difference between social cultural accumulation and ecological accumulation as tools to explain causality and maybe responsibility in colonial history?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think it is right that we do probably need to retain some attentiveness to different modes and methods of accumulation when we do this. And it may be that we attach different sort of political values to those different modes and methods of accumulation. Because in a sense, there are accumulatory dynamics that are participated in more directly by certain species. So rice cultivation in cattle, for instance, rice cultivation really does expand the cattle populations into new regions. But to explore that ecological accumulation that then has its own self-perpetuating element to it, the same causative role as, say, the modes of accumulation that are coming through, say, the Chettiar cattle, or the Chettiar credit systems, or to European-owned rice mills that are attached to this production, would be, I think, to really lose the power, the explanatory power of accumulation, and just render it a descriptive term. But your question has really prompted me to think about that more explicitly, and to maybe to think or be more precise, I think, about different modes and methods of accumulation that I'm seeing in the histories I write. But thank you. That's a really astute question.
Thank you. We are very nearly on the hour, but one final question has just popped in, which I will ask. Were elephants hunted for meat during the imperialistic period? If so, did the traders transport them?
So yes, elephants were hunted for meat. Generally speaking, so Burmese wouldn't necessarily kill elephants for meat, but if they died and the fresh meat was available, then they would be eaten by some communities within Burma. And there was certainly some, at least one notable former sepoy in the Indian Army who establishes himself up in the northern part of Myanmar and just kills for meat all the time without any license, breaking all the rules, to the knowledge of the European officials around him. And he's just killing so many elephants for meat, but more than he can sell. So I don't think it's really about meat. So there isn't a sort of well-established elephant meat industry, but they are sort of eaten on as a sort of on the side of the other things that happen to them.
Brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Thank you. It really has been a fascinating and really very, very imaginative lecture. I think what you've done is really shown us how what we can think of as natural, kind of a natural untouched world is really a really deeply managed world, powerfully impacted by kind of human interaction, and particularly that we could kind of dig into this and shed light on some really large and kind of questions about the colonial past that can be difficult to access through more conventional routes in. And it's been just fascinating, and I've enjoyed it very much indeed. I'd like to close, in addition to thanking Jonathan, by reminding everybody that our next lecture is coming up on the 2nd of November, and that will be Ludmilla Jordanova. It's a lecture that we do in collaboration with the Gresham Institute, portraits, biographies, and public history. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. Thank you very much to the audience for joining us, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, everyone.